Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Bible for August 1st, 2023. I am Reverend Dr. Mary Biedron, Senior Minister of North Congregational Church, and this is our weekly series looking at just like interesting background, Bible facts, elements that might come up in Bible study that don't always come up in sermons. We'll be doing a lot more background on the Sunday sermons and things like that. This summer, I've been going through the different genres of the books of the Bible. So this whole book is not really one book, right? It's actually a library, a biblios of a whole collection of different things, different genres written at different times. And we tend to come at it like it was one thing when instead it's really a whole lot of things. It's interesting to know what to keep. We've just been working this morning, some of us on the church archives, on understanding which letters and which documents and which ledgers can be kept because everything can't be kept and everything won't be kept. And some things aren't keepable because they'll finally just pass away. So a lot of ancient letters, which were very important, right? Because people couldn't talk on the phone, they couldn't do internet, they couldn't do any of those things, were matters of much more record. And I mean, yeah, we've got, the Rosetta Stone that had interpretations of different business activities in several languages, and it was a key to all sorts of other things. Our Bible goes back to ancient times. Even the most recent stuff that's in the Bible is ancient by our definition. It's more than 2,000 years old in many cases, and way older than that in terms of the Old Testament material. The epistles in the Bible are in two categories. And the first we talked about last week, which was the epistles written by Paul. Paul had his own way of expressing himself. He was really the first one to do Christian theology, to have an ecclesiology, a theology of the church, which he wrote about and outlined for a lot of the little baby churches that he was nurturing, as well as some of the churches that he was just trying to support and help out. And those are a very specific form. He wrote more in the form of a sophist, of an argument, of a particular almost legal language. And so when you get into some of the adoption language, some of the, pardon me, some of the language about atonement, Paul has a very legalistic view because this was really his thinking. At that time, there was not a canon of beliefs. There wasn't a set of creeds yet. The creeds really don't come into being until later. And some of the epistles, even of Paul, were then edited and corrected and made to be more broad, made to be somewhat less specific. Material was added later, and there's still a lot of debate here and there. You can tell from word usage, you can tell from types of argument, which things probably aren't by Paul. But then there's a whole other set of letters, not as many as what Paul wrote, but there's the letters of John, there's the letters of Peter, there's letters of James, there's the letter to the Hebrews, which does not have, it's sometimes attributed to Paul, but it is not written by Paul. And these letters follow a much more, I'm going to say, traditional epistolary form. Some of them are very short and contain specifics for specific congregations. Peter's letters are like that. John's letters are like that, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter. Attributed to those apostles. They were leaders of the early church. Is it all their writing? I don't know. Because one of the ways that epistles were formed is that the author would dictate it to a secretary. Even Paul did this. He did not write with his own hand much except his signature, according to what he says at the end of some of his letters. And so they were subject to interpretation. The arguments unfold in a certain way. What's interesting about them is, in the midst of helping churches think through their conflicts, think through their struggles with broader society, think through their confusion at how to organize themselves, these epistles offer some principles that we can then take and really you have used in our life of the church, in our ecclesiology, pretty heavily. So we have John writing about, beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and those who love, that love comes from God, and then we are in God. And this we know, that we love because God first loved us. That's a really important affirmation that we all treasure. Also, Peter's idea of the priesthood of all believers, which was very foundational to the establishment of Congregationalism, which is the tradition that we follow. The Puritans of England, and then the Puritans and Pilgrims of North America, of New England, really latched onto that whole idea that we are all a royal priesthood, that all believers are given something that allows them to make decisions in the church. And they don't need to be guided by overarching authorities. They need to instead have principles that they can then use, and those principles need to be based in the Bible. So it's interesting to look at those early congregational documents because they're all footnoted everywhere. Almost every sentence refers back to where in the Bible you can find this affirmation. It's kind of their bona fides. The many of the ancient letters are less creative. They've got some of them styles that are almost like form letters. And then there are others that are more like a theological treatise. So that's like the letter to the Hebrews. And although attributed to Paul, it's not by Paul, based on what I said about word order and word choice and ideology and a lot of things. The letters themselves were then carried through the Roman system of letter carriers or by private individuals. And so Paul often says, I'm sending you, I commend to you Barnabas and Timothy. And Barnabas and Timothy would show up with the papyrus or the other way that the letters were written. They would be read, they would be saved, they would be proclaimed in worship services. They would be used and treasured, which is funny because when we went through the archives, we've got a lot of letters. We've got some that are very important, and we've also got a lot where it's like, wow, this isn't anything to be saved. It just isn't. Thank you for your pledge. Things like that. They don't add to the information. They don't add to the life of the church. And there certainly were a lot of other letters that probably existed that didn't continue. So the other interesting kind of letter that exists, and I didn't know where else to put it, so I'm going to mention it here, and then next week, I will talk about Revelation. I'll talk about the Christian apocalyptic literature. But in Revelation, John talks about the letters that the angels bring from God to the churches. The church to the church in Philadelphia, to the church in this place and that place, and it is a lot of it encouragement of those churches in times of great stress. So Revelation was written at a point when persecution of the Christians had become pretty prevalent, and so these scrolls come, and they're in very encoded fashion that probably was really clearly understood by the recipients, but maybe it's not as necessarily clear to us as those would have been. And so we see those and we read them, and we have to be careful. Those were written to specific churches, as were all of these letters, and it is really essential to use some of the resources that exist to unpack the context of those letters, because some of them were written to churches that were persecuted, some that were written to churches that had fallen away, some were written, like the one to Philadelphia, churches that have survived tremendous difficulties, earthquakes, and all kinds of natural disasters. And some of the use of those out of context makes it very difficult to really make sense of it, because some of them are they use extreme language, they use apocalyptic language, they use coded language for the Roman Empire, because if they sent something through the Roman system with direct references to why Rome should be overthrown, they would definitely be in trouble. And so these letters to the churches is to commend them, to commend their perseverance, to commend them to become more persevering, to accuse them of perhaps becoming lukewarm, and to encourage them as the author of Revelation, it's attributed to John of Patmos, saw fit. They are still epistolary styles. They don't have the salutation and they don't have the endings that are typical, but they do have some of that form. These are the words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts and no one will open. They're sort of a cross between prophecy and epistle. So that's really all that I've got for today. This is kind of a shorty, but I just wanted to really wind up this thing about letters to say you're reading someone else's mail. And just as if you go through and you find a package of old letters from your grandparents, we've got a box in our house that's old letters that I got from my parents and my grandparents. They're all gone now. So even the ones where my grandmother writes what she's making for dinner is interesting to me. Will that be interesting for generations on beyond? I doubt it. But then there are some others that are really letters where people are recalling their lives, recalling their circumstances, that show and say a lot about them and a lot about who we are, who are their grandchildren and great grandchildren. And this is how it is with the letters in the Bible. These letters have come to us, they've been treasured, they've been prized and retained. They have been copied and recopied. They've been added to. They've been subtracted from. They've been made into something that is part of our canon of biblical literature. But I want to remind you that when you see things, particularly in the epistles and absolutely in Revelation, as I said in church on Sunday, here we have the gospel. And here we have the other things. And our temptation is to use other things to reflect on what the gospel might mean. But we are Christians. We are followers of Jesus. We are people who live by the gospel. And that means that letters, revelation, all of those things are to be viewed in the light of the gospel. And so when we see something in these things that looks like bad news, when we see things that make God sound hateful, when we feel like these are encouraging us to despise one another, that light from the gospel needs to shine back on them to say, how else could we look at this? What does this mean? Is this metaphorical? Is this something that needs to be contextualized and say, this was true in the Roman Empire and it is not true now? But our plumb line, our guiding light, our guidance in all of these things is to look at the love of God made known in Christ. So next week, I'll be thinking about Christian apocalyptic literature. There's one book of it, the book of Revelation, but it's a doozy. And so I'm going to go through some of the highlights of that one. I have preached just this past Sunday, not this past Sunday, 2 Sundays ago, about the ideas in Revelation, the ideas of making all things new, and it's going to pop up at various times during the coming months as we think about beginnings and endings. If you feel really brave, you could take a quick little trip through Revelation and look for all of those things, the angels and the scrolls and the trumpets and the unmaking of the world and the whore of Babylon. And we will visit all those exciting things and so much more next week. In the meantime, I hope that understanding the value of people saying what they believe in letters that can be sent to others for clarity and for other things maybe inspires you, whether it's writing letters or keeping a journal of some sort where you write down your own thoughts about your world and what it means for your faith to exist in this world where we live now today. And however you do it, I hope that you will live in the light of the gospel, and may God be with you till we meet again.